Well, good evening. That was louder than I anticipated, and I'm whispering. But I just wanted to reintroduce Dr. Jeff Miller, who is here to help us out on Sunday night. I call it helping out. I'm not sure if it's Bible study, if you're teaching us a few good things. So he's going to help us out tonight so that we get to enjoy this lesson and take a little bit more of his wisdom from him. If you were here last week, I'm sure you enjoyed it. I did as well. For those of you watching, well, welcome back. So if you have any questions online, just type them into the comment section. I'll be watching to make sure we get those to Dr. Jeff, anything of that nature. If anything's not working, anything's broken online, don't call me. But we're glad to be here, so I'm just going to let you take over.
I see a little green light. Okay, great. Thanks so much for being here tonight. It's good to see you. Everybody get a handout as you came in? There was a big stack and a little stack, and you want the big one, the one that has some color images. The little stack was left over from last week, I think. Just a couple of them still sitting there. But this is the fancier one. Color images. I feel highfalutin. So it's good to be back. Thanks for your attendance tonight in the room and online. And we are on week 2 now of 7 weeks called Chapters in the Development of the Bible. The fun title is From Papyrus to Pixels, meaning how it used to be and how it sometimes now is when you read the Bible on a screen. Chapters in the Development of the Bible. The first box at the top of page 1 there is just it's word for word the same, I think, as last week. It's just some comments about where the 7 weeks are going. But let's go ahead to the middle of the page and say, looking back to last week, the topic was how do Bibles differ? The overarching topic was just that they do. And we've all become accustomed to reading the Bible in English and just understanding that when someone else has got a different translation on the other side of the room or whatever, that there's something must be going on. It's not a big deal typically, but we just smooth right on by. And usually that's the thing to do. That's the right thing to do. Nevertheless, we took some time to talk about why might those differences come in. Ancient manuscripts are different from one another. Translators and publishers. I don't think I mentioned publishers last week, but sometimes it's not the translator who is doing something. It's the publisher who has hired the translator, who has a preference or an agenda. And one of the examples we gave there was different Bible translation teams will have a different view of how smooth that Old Testament and New Testament connection should be. Obviously, number 3 is the one I didn't need to explain at all, really. The English language changes over time. Number 4, translators frequently have to choose between what it says and what it means. I gave a couple examples of that. Another way to say that is, how literal are you going to be as you translate the Bible? And usually, translators will lean away from being literal because they're trying to make the Bible understandable, of course. But sometimes leaning away from literal can get you in trouble, can end up with a misleading way of saying something, or just frustrate a lot of people who prefer their Bible to be more literal. The 5th one, for better or for worse, translators are people, and they have to discern what a verse or sentence means before they can put it into English. You don't want an English sentence that doesn't mean anything. And then a reason I didn't mention last week, because of course there's more than I just gave you. And another reason that English Bibles will sometimes vary, which I think is a positive reason, but nevertheless something we have to be aware of, is that it's pretty common for the way that a Hebrew Old Testament text or a Greek New Testament text, it's pretty common for that text to be rich, beautiful, eloquent, powerful, nuanced, carefully crafted, to the point that English just simply isn't going to represent it perfectly. And so if this team of translators over here is studying a parable of Jesus, for example, and discerns some cleverness, some nuance, some elegance to the text, and they come up with a translation that's able to catch most but not all of that, and then this translation team over here does the same thing. They catch most but not all. Of course, there's going to be a difference there in how it comes across in English. So that's review. Let's go to the cool pictures now. Piano and a car. So these pictures have to do with me. Let's start with the piano. I play the piano. I do that in church much more frequently than I teach, but I'm glad to be here teaching. I'm not a piano tuner. I'm not a piano technician. I couldn't build one. I couldn't fix one other than some really basic things. And that makes sense, right? You don't need to be a piano mechanic to play the piano or to just to appreciate it, just to listen. But it would be really weird, wouldn't it, if I finished playing the piano in church after doing so for over 30 years, and then I got up and I noticed the strings, and I thought, wow, I never noticed the strings before. There's strings in eyes. Like, people would think, who is this guy? Like, how could you not know? I mean, even if I don't have the tool to tighten them, even if I don't know what they're made of, even if et cetera, I know they're there. I have looked under the lid enough times to know a few things about the little hammer that's striking it and all that. My first car, I know you're jealous, was a 1968 Camaro, red in color with a black top. It wasn't that one. I just grabbed that off the internet. But it was exactly like that one. And I'm kind of on the other end of the spectrum with cars. I don't know anything. Like, I know there's a motor in there, okay? But that's the end of it. And one of the things I experienced quite a bit back in those days when I owned that car, it's kind of funny, I think about it. When I bought that car, it was 17 years old and already considered a classic. And now it's been twice that long again. Like, I shouldn't have sold that car, right? I should have put it in storage and just, what can you do? But it was a very common experience to me. Almost every time I was at a gas station filling up with gas, somebody would walk up to me and engage me in conversation about that car. What's under the hood? Like, I don't know, an engine? I honestly didn't know. If someone would have told me, I wouldn't know what the numbers meant or anything. And so you can enjoy a piano without knowing what's under the lid. It's a little odd. And you can own and drive and highly value a Camaro and not know anything about it, which I did for a few years. And it made me feel funny. Like, I never felt like I needed to become an auto mechanic, but I always felt like, man, I should just memorize a few things to say when people ask me, because I'm just looking dumber and dumber over the years. Okay, so the title of this lesson up at the top of the page, a little bit of a curious title, Something Every Christian Should Do at Least Once. I think somewhere else in here, I expanded that and said every Christian who can, maybe not every Christian, okay, but you and I can. We have the internet. Every manuscript picture in here came from Wikipedia. Not hard to find. Well, maybe not. One of them didn't, but the website's given right at the top of the page. Not hard to find manuscript images like it would have been a generation ago. Something every Christian should do at least once is look at the Bible in the form that it used to be, before paper, before the printing press, in the Middle Ages or earlier. I don't think it's something every Christian should do every Sunday. I'm not arguing that. I'm not full of disdain for the hundreds of First Presbyterian members who didn't make it here tonight. Like, who are these people? You know, that's not my point at all. Some of you might be interested enough to do what we're going to do tonight, like 5, 6, 10, 15 times. That'd be great. But I'm only really making a simple case. We all ought to do it at least once, just to raise some awareness and some appreciation for the tremendously long development that resulted in Bibles, like in, pew Bibles upstairs, Bibles in your home, Bibles in your phone. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to lift up the hood, so to speak. We're going to lift up that grand piano lid, so to speak, and kind of see what's in there that we usually don't look at. And we don't need to look at very often. You can still appreciate and memorize and John 3:16 without ever seeing it on parchment, for example. Well, and I'll say this. I said this last week. I'll say it. I'll double it up this week. Please ask questions if you have any questions. Teachers, including myself, sometimes think they said this, but they actually said that. And if that happens, just raise your hand and go, hey, that didn't make sense. Could you say that again? And if we don't finish this handout, that is fine. We'll just pick it up next week. If we get into a conversation about one of the images or something I said, that would be good. Better to engage than to just sit there, unengaged. Well, a perfectly sensible place to start is P52. I think you'll agree. P stands for papyrus, which is the writing material. I mean, the paper. You know that. And 52 is just simply the number they gave it. Why? Because 51 had been taken. Like it's the 52nd New Testament papyrus discovered. And so they just give them a number. And every year, maybe not every year, but every once in a while, another one comes to light. And so I have to get online every couple years and double check that I know how many papyrus manuscripts there are. There's over 100, about 118 right now. Now you can tell from the image that that's one piece of papyrus, and the photograph is the front and the back. The size of the thing would be about the palm of my hand. I don't have a very big hand either. So I guess that's probably just a little bit bigger than the real size. It's blown up a little bit for the sake of the handout. And you can see now when that thing gets discovered in Egypt, and all New Testament papyrus manuscripts are from Egypt, simply because of the climate. Like apparently if you leave something lying around in Egypt, it'll last 1,000 or more years than if you left it lying around in East Tennessee. Okay, but when you can imagine that when someone discovers that, it's not just immediate like, oh, it's a piece of the New Testament right there. No, it's a long process to just figure out what it is, because it's so brief. And the words on the front and the words on the back are a page removed from one another. And not very many of those words are all there. It's such a small piece that what you have is a cluster of syllables with a couple words in the thick part. This one, I said it's a sensible place to start because it's the oldest. It might not be the oldest. How could we really know that? But it is generally accepted as most likely the oldest New Testament manuscript available anywhere today. And oldest here means mid, maybe early 2nd century. So 120, 130, 140, somewhere in that range. The main way that they date these things is the handwriting, comparing it to all the others that are available. And so the fewer words you have, the fewer handwriting examples you have, it's hard. It's hard to date anything like this, but especially if it's just really brief. Yale University, I wasn't there, but I've heard this, I trust it to be true, offered $63 million for this manuscript somewhere in the last decade or so. And the museum that houses it said, no, thank you. If somebody finds one that's older, price is probably going to go down, right? Down into just like 10 million or something like that. And not all New Testament manuscripts are valued in the millions, but this one, because it's so old. Yes, sir.
Do we know what language is this?
Yes, this is Greek. Mm-hmm. Right. How do we know it? Well, even though I've said it's the earliest New Testament manuscript, there's hundreds of non-New Testament manuscripts from this era, from before it, even from much longer before it. And so there's plenty of Greek manuscripts of other sources. So the handwriting is not unusual, right? The place where this was found, as a matter of fact, was full of lots of manuscripts of lots of kinds. And they're going through it just piece at a time. Right. Now, the next page will get us a little bit better picture. No pun intended. This one here, this is one page out of a much longer document. Well, that was true of the other one too, but with the one on the previous page, that's all that's left. Like a couple grams of papyrus is all that's left of that manuscript. This one, there's, I don't know how many pages, but most of 10 New Testament letters are available in this. There's a copy of it in the seminary library over at Milligan in the manual. Not the real thing, okay, but a copy of it. And it's about that thick, you know. The real thing would be thicker because papyrus is not going to lay as flat as paper. It's thicker than paper and it's not going to lay as flat. So the real thing is probably about like that. But this is just one page out of a document that originally would have been a couple hundred pages, and today is 100 or more. Several pages from the front and several pages from the back are just disintegrated and lost. And it's a really good example to illustrate a few things. And I have some things in mind I'd like to point out about it, but let's start with you. When you look at this page, this Greek writing from a early 3rd century manuscript, we're looking at it's about 100 years or later than the other one, so 220, 230, 240. Just make some observations about it. What strikes you?
Seems like there's probably a title, subtitle kind of thing going on, maybe a page identification.
Right, the third line here, well, I'm calling it the third line. The top is a number. It's number 41. The next line, which is mostly full, and then it has about an inch of just a like a big long dash at the end, is the last line of Romans. And then the thing that you're probably pointing out is the next line. It says, to the Hebrews. And it's got 3 dashes above it and 3 dashes below it. Just decorative marks, like right click, grab some clip art or something like that. Right, so that title, which is the third, or maybe the fourth, because there's a little bit of material there, but you can it's centered. You're exactly right, to the Hebrews. So what you're looking at here is the last line of Romans and the first page of Hebrews. Any other observations about it? Yes.
It's surprising to me that there's wasted space. It looks, was papyrus so easily available that I would think that it would be treated more precious. You didn't have a lot of white space, is what I was thinking.
Okay, there is a good solid margin at the okay, the comment, if you couldn't hear it, especially if you're online, is that you're taking notice of how much white space, or we might say tan space, that there is. So they do have a margin on each side. Most of the left margin, well, it's not mostly still there, but you can see how wide it was. The right one's a little more worn away, and the top and the bottom have about the same. Now you're right in to notice that and think about it, because it is pricey. It's definitely not cheap to produce a book in those days. However, papyrus is cheaper than parchment, animal skin. And since it's in Egypt, and that's where most papyrus was made, it's probably a little cheaper in Egypt to do this than, like, say, in Rome, where you might have to ship it in. And to build on your observation, a lot of ancient books are from the hands of wealthy people. And so, yeah, it would be pricey. And somebody wanted to have a collection of Paul's letters, which is what this document is, a collection of Paul's letters. And probably in addition to what you've observed with the margins, just take notice of how, even though it's really, really old now, you can kind of see that it's well written, it's carefully written. The letters are all straight up and down, and the margin is justified on the left and nearly justified on the right. And we mentioned those decorative lines. And so it's almost calligraphy. It's a professional doing this, and that professional would have been paid. As a matter of fact, thank you so much for the good segue. You lead me. You see this little thing right here? It's like there's a title page, there's a number, right at the top in the middle, 41, and then a line of text that almost fills the line. And then off a little bit to the right, not quite to the margin, is something that looks more scribbled, more cursive than the rest of the page. That's the number 1,000. And this manuscript has 1,000 lines in Romans. And so what that is the scribe who's been hired to do it telling the person who hired him or her, how much you owe me, because he's being paid by the line. So it's clocking in and clocking out, more or less, like just tabulating. Further evidence that the owner of this is a wealthy person, okay? What else? Any comments or questions about this page? Yes, Ken.
Where did the scribe get the information to write?
Where did the scribe get the information to write? Do you see the excitement? I don't know if you can tell the excitement. So this scribe is copying Hebrews, well, Romans as well, but this page mostly Hebrews. In Egypt, in the early 3rd century, Hebrews is written more than 100 years earlier. And so it seems that the scribe must be copying from a previously existing copy of Hebrews. That's what you meant, right? Okay. And let's take it a step further. That previously existing copy of Hebrews, probably not Paul's copy, but it's something that there's another one, and there's another one. And was there a question online? Oh, yes. Thanks so much. And so the big challenge, that's why I got excited, is to try to discern not just what's here on the page, but what was on the page of the one we no longer have before it, which of course is harder. It's hard enough to look at this and read it, right? But since this isn't from the hand of a New Testament author, we know it's been copied and probably copied many times. And later in this packet, we'll get into that kind of information. And when we do, feel free to speak up again, Ken, if you wish. Now I'm going to look at this question that Kayla just handed me. The question is, when we read a translation, are the several translations, like where do they come from? One of the choices in the question is, are they taken from various manuscripts from various years? The answer is yes. They are taken from various manuscripts from various years. The King James, for example, created 400 years ago. The New Testament, I'm not speaking of the Old Testament, the New Testament of the King James utilized somewhere in the neighborhood of about a dozen, let's say maybe I'm remembering wrong, so 15 to 20 manuscripts. Today, something like the New International Version will utilize more than 100 manuscripts. And there's way more than 100 available. And so that is one of the reasons that things differ from text, from Bible to Bible, especially over when you go from the King James 400 years ago to something like the Revised Standard Version of the 1950s to something today. There's manuscripts being discovered and studied. When one is discovered, it doesn't mean they know what's in it right away. It might be 2, 3, 4, 10, 20, 30 years until somebody, finds the time and the money and the expertise to figure out what that new discovery says and put it in a book or put it online. And so there's always new information. You can imagine we're to the point now where there's not shockingly new information. It's not like there are places in the New Testament where we just don't know what's going on. So we're to the point, happily, where the changes are small. So the answer to the question handed to me is, yes, English Bibles are based on original language Bibles, which come from a wide variety of manuscripts, more and more over the course of time. Let's go back to this. Yes?
Is priority given to the older manuscripts?
Yes, priority is given to the older ones. And that would have to be a general rule, of course, because, well, some of the older you get, the less you have. Like the oldest one is only 20 words or so from the Gospel of John. And so even though $63 million wasn't enough to buy it, that scrap contributes nothing to our knowledge of what the Gospel of John says. Because it's just one verse on this side and one verse on that side, and those verses are not in question or debated. So the older you get, yes, they are valued more and prioritized, but sometimes the older, it's more valued as an archaeological artifact than it would be as a resource for discerning the words of the text. But this one here is so big, page after page after page, that it is tremendously important for discerning the wording of the text. I want to point out there's no spaces between the words. And that's not because they're trying to save space, as you noted, right? If they were trying to save space, they wouldn't have big margins. It's just because it was their custom. They don't have spaces between the words for the very same reason we do. It's just what we do. And we kind of need them because we're used to them. But if we had all grown up reading English without spaces, we'd be used to it by now, even though it does seem like it would be odd. So they don't put spaces between words. They do break words at the end of the line, just like we do, but they don't put a hyphen. So a word can start here and end here with no real heads up that that's going on. Notice, of course, that the edges are frayed over the course of time. That bottom left edge is probably frayed the most because of being held, being handled, being turned. One thing I want to point out, if you go to the main body of the text, forget about the titles up at the top, and go to the second line and go in about 7 letters, 8 letters, 7 or 8 letters. And you come to these 2 letters that have a little line above the top, like less than a centimeter, just a little line above 2 letters. Again, that's the second line of the body, the paragraph, 7, 8 letters in. That's the word for God. Here's I don't know if I should call it trivia, because it's about God. Here's a peculiarity about all New Testament manuscripts. All ancient Greek New Testament manuscripts abbreviate God's name. Not God's name, the word God, and the word Jesus, and the word Christ, and words like Son of Man. They give you the first letter and the last letter, and the little line above it is an indication that it's an abbreviation. That little line is doing the same thing that periods do for us. If we abbreviate something, we might put a period after each of the initials as a quick heads up that that's an abbreviation. We wouldn't have to, but we often do. No one knows why. We all have a general sense of why. It's to treat these words with special respect. But it's kind of a mystery, like how early did that start? Did Matthew, when he was writing, abbreviate Jesus, Christ, Son, God? Maybe, probably not, but we don't know because we don't have originals. So that's one interesting thing about it. One thing that accomplished was that a lot of people in the ancient world are illiterate, okay, understandably. And, in our culture, if someone can't read, they will very often be able to identify a Bible anyway. The church I was at this morning, big black Bible on the communion table. Like if I didn't know anything, if I couldn't even spell Holy Bible, that's a Bible. Like nobody has a book that big with a gold ribbon coming out of it and sitting on a table in church, right? So these abbreviations kind of serve that purpose. If you can't read, but you open up a page of this book and you see 5 or 7 places where there's a little line above 2 letters, then you think, oh, that's Scripture. I can tell. Even if you can't read, you can probably read just a tiny bit, and to know the word for God, for example, would be well within your grasp. Well, I got one more thing I want to say about this picture, and then we'll move on. I grabbed this off of the internet, obviously. And, the internet, well, it's not going to have a picture of every page of every manuscript. If it does, maybe it does, but it's going to be really hard to find. But this one's super easy to find it. And the reason that certain pictures are easy to find is because they're interesting. There's something about them that makes people go, well, let's put that online, With the former one, it was because it's the earliest. With this one, it's because when I said that's the last line of Romans, I wasn't lying. That's the last line of Romans in this manuscript. But in your copy of Romans, there's a whole nother column. Well, that's not true. There's a whole 3 or 4 more verses. So it's odd that the oldest copy of Romans, which is this, the oldest Romans in the world, lacks the concluding paragraph, which goes back to your question. I said yes, but I backed off. So we prioritize older manuscripts, but not to the extent that they're always the accurate one. And so even though that's the case, I don't think you'll ever find an English Bible that just cuts off the end of Romans. So back to your question, Ken. You had your hand up. Don't forget what you're going to say. Because it's possible that we learn from this that the only copy of Romans available to this scribe was one that had already, sometime prior to it, lost its last paragraph. Go ahead if you were going to.
Well, I was just thinking, we obviously don't have manuscripts for everything that's in our printed Bible today. Is that correct?
No, we do. We have manuscripts for everything in our Bibles. Well, all the text, all the Holy Scripture, right? In some cases, there's going to be thousands of manuscripts for a particular passage. In some places, not nearly as many. Like Matthew 1:1, for example. So many manuscripts have lost their first page just because of the time, that you're not going to have as many that have Matthew 1:1 as Matthew 10:1, just for example. And another example would be, certain books, Matthew, Romans, many others, are just way, way more frequently copied than Jude or 2 Peter. To put it another way, not judging First Pres, just if your church is like my church, if you grew up like I grew up, we study and read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, way more than we study and read 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John. Jude. That's been going on for millennia, right? So there's not as many copies of something like Jude. But still, they're all there. They're all there. Okay, let's go to the next page. This one is parchment instead of papyrus. And this may be an odd thing to say, maybe even a gross thing to say, but I got some respect for whoever was the first person to look at an animal and think, I could write on the backside of that skin there. So that's what they're doing. And it is much more expensive to use sheepskin or goat skin or some other sort of hide to create a book. And those kinds of books would generally be created, and they're going to last much, much longer. And so they would be created for churches, for libraries, for particularly wealthy people, not usually just for a normal, everyday person. Down at the bottom left, you can see the wrinkles. Not really well, but because it's animal skin, it is dried up over the years, and it's got that look. But it's really sturdy stuff. I mean, it's leather, okay? So, imagine your belt 2,000 years from now. It's not going to be in perfect condition, but it'll be better than a piece of paper or papyrus. You can see there's a few places on this one where there are spaces. We've moved a couple hundred years further here, and they're starting to put in a centimeter or so gap 5 or 7 times per page. So they don't have paragraphs like we think of paragraphs, but they're moving in that direction. They're starting to help you find where you want to start. That purple arrow that's coming in from the left there indicates the beginning of the Lord's Prayer. And there's a space right before the beginning of the Lord's Prayer, obviously to help someone find it when they're just browsing the page. Still no spaces between words other than the occasional gap that I just mentioned. This one is one of very few manuscripts that are housed in the United States. There are, when I say very few, I don't mean just like 2 or 3. But compared to the thousands that are available, most of them are in Europe. This one's in Washington, D.C., in one of the Smithsonian buildings. And that's what the W stands. I'm not joking now. This sounds like a silly thing to say, but that's what the W stands for. Codex W, Codex Washington is what it's called. And then just to sound fancy, they put a Latin ending on it. Washingtonensis. Okay. As if Washington were a Latin word. You can see the edge is still brittle, and probably oil from hands over the centuries has caused the edge to fray a little bit. Not as bad as the papyrus. And there's a few places where you see those abbreviations. There's one in the 4th line, about an inch from the right. There's a little line above 3 letters. I said they abbreviate with 2, but with longer words, sometimes 3. And I also said with the other one that, this is one of, I don't know how many, but over 100 pages of a manuscript. And you're not just going to find every page of that manuscript pretty easily on the internet. So why this one? Well, this one, because it has, kind of like the other one, lacked the ending of Romans, which is an oddity. This one includes the last couple lines of the Lord's Prayer. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Most early manuscripts, I'm tempted to say all manuscripts older than this one, but don't record that and put it online or anything. I'd have to double check to see if I'm right. Don't have that. The earliest versions of the Lord's Prayer end and deliver us from evil. And that's it. And then later manuscripts say, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Have you ever noticed that there seems to be a difference there? The Lord's Prayer is pretty down to earth. Give me enough bread for today or tomorrow, my daily bread. But then the last part is very kind of high church, flamboyant language. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory. And probably what's happened there is some scribe, a few hundred years into the history of the church, put a little doxology, a little outburst of praise at the end of the Lord's Prayer. We might say to kind of church it up a little bit. Some denominations, not mine, not yours, to my knowledge, will treat the Lord's Prayer like a responsive reading. The leader says, Our Father who art in heaven, and goes all the way down to, and deliver us from the evil one. And then the congregation responds, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. To represent that those two things, there's a difference there. One is from Jesus, recorded by Matthew, and the other comes later from probably a monk a couple hundred years into the church. So that's the reason that this page of this manuscript is readily available online, because there's something interesting about it.
So if we use the oldest manuscript for today's Bible, why do we use that?
Well, the question was, if we use the oldest manuscripts for today's Bibles, why do we continue to include that? Okay, double answer. First answer, remember I mentioned the publishers. It's not just the translators, it's the publishers. Who's putting the money out, to make the NIV or the new RSV or something? And that person, or more likely that organization, is going to prefer a Bible that kind of sounds like everybody expects it to. One thing I've noticed, this is a little bit different, but it's the same idea. There's some Bibles. The English Standard Version is this way. If anybody out there reads the English Standard Version, you might come across this. It's pretty modern language, pretty, it's kind of like you and I talk. But then when you get to famous texts, hallowed be thy name. Like, how often does any of us say hallowed outside of the Lord's Prayer? I've noticed that the thing about the ESV, the English Standard Version, that I've noticed is that in the Christmas story, it just feels 100 years older than the rest of the surrounding text. Probably the publisher wanted the standard phrases. There was no room for them in the inn, that kind of thing. And so that's one answer to your question is that, well, what I just said. The other answer is that often it's not in there. We just kind of think it is. I would think that if you just go to whatever Bible you've got with you or the Pew Bible upstairs, it's going to do something with the kingdom and the power and the glory. It's going to put it in italics with a footnote. It might put the whole thing in the footnote. It might put brackets around it. But we usually encounter that in a bulletin, on a screen, or just in our memories. And we don't usually encounter it on the page of a relatively recently published Bible. And so feel free to check me on that, and maybe you'll see that Bibles written in the last few decades aren't including that. Or if they are, they're probably putting a footnote to indicate it, to indicate something about it. Anything else about Codex Washington? Codex means book. I should have said that. Fancy word for book. We don't really need that word because we all know what a book is. But it goes back to a time when some books folded open and some books rolled. And so a scroll and a codex are two physical forms of a book. And so codex will often be used. When you jump ahead into the early Middle Ages, the end of Middle Ages, things get fancy. Can you tell right away that that's just a whole different deal? First of all, you got some red ink. Thank you for the color photocopies, First Pres, putting out big bucks for my handouts. The top is red. And that top thing right there is what happens in a lot of modern Bibles. It's just indicating what story's on this page. It's like a subheading. And the story that it's indicating doesn't start until line 6. And so line 6, the first letter is scooted out a little bit, and it's got some squiggles and jiggles over there, which match. You see that little, there's like it looks like a fraction almost with a Z on the bottom half. It's telling you, when you get to line 6 of this page, like, that's the story you're going to find. And so you can see what that's for. Same thing it is in English. You got this big old, like a Bible might be that thick, and you're looking for the story of the man who got his hand healed in the synagogue one day. That's this story. It's going to be a lot easier to find if the title is up at the top in red ink. So this is calligraphy. This is more flowing. We would call it cursive. It is cursive, but also it's written in a careful way. It's got some decorative things, like at the end of line 5, there's a couple little plus marks, probably crosses to fill the space. The very last letter on the page is a little letter inside of a big letter. They just do that kind of decorative thing to make it an elegant product. And, in case you wanted to know, it's way more difficult to read Greek cursive than the previous couple pages.
The word have more letters in them than what we would have in our words today.
Do the words have more letters in them than we would encounter in English today? A little bit. Greek tends to have longer words and kind of superfluous vowels and such. Hebrew's the opposite. Hebrew tends to be shorter. Old Testament stuff, any given word in Hebrew compared to its equivalent in English is probably going to be shorter. I hadn't really thought that before, but you're right. The equivalent in Greek would quite possibly be longer, filling up more space, more pages. All right, let me glance at the clock here. We've got 8 or so minutes. Yeah.
I was interested about the ink. Is this, when the coloring came in and how long the ink has, lasted too? Is that technology in the paper kind of progressed at the same rate?
I appreciate the question. I'm not an expert on ink, but I will say, let me do what professors do. They talk around a question, okay? Going back to the first couple manuscripts, well, really any of these, the person who wrote that, remember I said that someone was hired to write it? That's an actual job in those days. That person would not only be gifted and trained in how to write carefully and well and proofread their work, but they also made their own ink. And so they would have a little kit. I've got my, like an X-Acto knife and a roll of papyrus, and I've got different kinds of pens, and I've got different kinds of ink. And brown and black ink were really common, even in these really old ones back in Jesus' lifetime and Paul's lifetime. Also kind of a apricot color, like a more shiny brown, a little bit of orange in the brown would be very common. I'm sure they had red ink back then, but it's not used as much as in these later manuscripts. And I couldn't tell you whether that's because red ink became more common or just, we're moving into an era where there's a lot more money available, like in cathedrals and monasteries, and maybe they just have more resources to make things fancy. I think maybe you have a second career you're going to be a student of ancient ink. Go ahead.
I like to think of this as the first red letter edition of the King James.
Yeah.
Actually, there was
Right.
But I wonder if in fact they colored that to show how soon they started changing. Red letters show that the words of Christ are in red. I guess correct. Is that?
Mm-hmm.
And then when did they start that?
I don't know when they started that. I would think that doesn't come in until printing presses, because that's going to take so much red ink. But I don't know. I don't know for sure. And I wouldn't think it would come in early. The question, if you didn't hear it, I should repeat these things for online, is the custom of putting the words of Christ in red. Let's think about what I just said. It couldn't be early printing press. Not that it couldn't, but you see what you're going to have to do there. You're going to have to run that same sheet of paper through the printing press twice. Once with red ink and once with black, and you got to get it right or you've just wasted a lot of time. And so that's probably even later, like into mechanical. By mechanical, I mean electronic printing presses. Good question. Reflecting on these things, some Bibles have a gold and silver ink. Not very much, of course, because that's I'm talking about literal gold now, not just gold color. And that's further evidence that in some places they were considered to be, well, like the big Bible I saw this morning at a different church. That's probably a $100 Bible, even when it was bought 50 years ago. So in certain places, they were truly ornate and not really expected to be read on a daily basis or for personal devotion. But there's a few that have, like the actual pages, the parchment has been dyed purple and then written on, which again, that would be the equivalent of what we would think of that as thousands and thousands of dollars for a Bible. Well, I appreciate all these questions. We only got about 5 minutes left. The pictures are done, so sad, but there is a purple triangle on the next page. And I'll talk about this page just a little bit, and then we'll pick it up here next week. So next week will be lesson 2B. It won't be lesson 3, and that's perfectly fine. So English translations come from Hebrew and Greek Bibles, Hebrew Old Testament, Greek New Testament. And those Bibles come from the manuscripts. So that's what my triangle is trying to illustrate here. And the title of this lesson series is Chapters in the Development of, and it's on different weeks. I'm going to be in different places in there. So last week, it was what I was really talking about was the gap, not the gap, but the process between how does a modern English-speaking translator go from the Greek text in front of him onto the page of the NIV? What are some of the things that person would encounter? But this week has been more about, not that translator, not his or her work, but the people who give us Greek Bibles, ancient Greek, and Hebrew Bibles. You can go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com and buy a Greek Bible or a Hebrew Bible. But what are you buying? What you're buying is a team of scholars' work who have sorted through lots and lots of manuscripts. I don't think I should go further on this page, so let me just throw out a couple things. Well, as I glance down, they're on this page, so I shouldn't have said that. But just a couple things, and we've only got 2 minutes, so then we'll go. Greek New Testament manuscripts, there's about 5,200 of those on the planet today. There's probably a few more that we haven't found yet. But in museums and in a few other places, really old churches in Europe, in the Vatican, places like that. There's about 55, excuse me. I just glanced down and hopefully I was right when I typed it, not when I said it. About 5,500 manuscripts in the Greek language from the days before the printing press. But the days before the printing press is a very long time. The very first one I showed you was 2nd century. And then there's more all the way up into the early 1500s. So an astonishingly long amount of time. The 5,500 manuscripts that we have available today is surely way less than 1% of the ones that were available when they were new. I mean, almost, the vast majority of them just simply been lost. By lost, I mean, fallen apart, lost in a fire, lost in a flood, disintegrated over time, etc. But nevertheless, there's 5,500. And that means, what that number means is anything from a full New Testament, like 30 or 40 pounds of papyrus in a big old codex, all the way down to that first one I showed you, which is a couple grams with a verse of John on one side and a verse. Both of those, the big one and the small one, would count as one manuscript. And you're just supposed to understand that we don't have 5,500 complete manuscripts, which goes back to one of the things I was responding to Kent about, which is that, there's going to be places like Jude where there's not anywhere near 5,500 manuscripts of Jude. But places like Romans, where there's, I don't know how many, but probably in the neighborhood of 5,000 or so, because so many Bibles would include Romans. So if you ever hear anybody say 5,000, 5,500, that's what they mean. And they're right. If you ever hear someone say 20,000 or a bigger number, what they're doing is they're throwing in the other languages, because there's a lot of Latin manuscripts. There's more than 10,000 Latin manuscripts. And then you've got other languages as well. Syriac, 2 or 3 Egyptian languages, etc. And so sometimes you'll hear somebody, or just read it in a book or online, like, we have 20,000, 25,000 manuscripts. Well, they mean all the languages pre-printing press. If they use something 5,200, 5,400, something like that, they mean the Greek. The Greek ones, of course, are going to be more helpful than the others. And it's 8 o'clock, 8:02 as a matter of fact. So I'm going to wrap things up. Kayla, you look like you're about to tell me what to do. Not, okay. So please come back. We'll pick it up right here. And the question on the second half of this handout is, well, what are they doing? What are the people who have access to 5,500 manuscripts doing? Like, how are they sorting this out, putting it in a form that an English translator or a Spanish translator or whoever can use and make manageable? All right, thanks so much for your time. Thank you in the back and online as well. Appreciate you all. We stand dismissed.